Physiological data, the iris and retina. First, let's acquaint ourselves to some basics about anatomy of the eye. The iris and retina are both features of the eye. Up here in this image, you have what you can see is a person's eye, and this is a cross-section, what's called a sagittal cross-section, because it cuts it down the middle into like a left half or a right half that shows all the internal structures of the eye. Externally, you can make out easily a person's pupil, and then there's this colored circle around it, blue, green, brown. It can be very, very, very dark brown and look almost as black as the pupil, and this is called the iris. And this middle part is the pupil. The iris is the colored part of the eye, the pupil is the middle black dot. The white is the sclera, and over the iris, you can see, so here's a picture, here's the white of the eye, and the sclera. You can see the white of the eye here is analogous to this area. You can see that the sclera extends over the iris, which would be here in the cross section, and the pupil, which would be in the middle, is a clear cover. And that clear cover over the iris and pupil together is the cornea. If you're used to putting in contact lenses, or you've seen somebody put in contacts, how it just covers the iris and the pupil part of their eye, that covering, that contact lens covers the person's cornea. So the cornea is that outside covering over the iris and pupil. The white of the eye is otherwise called the sclera. Interestingly, the iris is actually a long circular muscular diaphragm. Here's the iris once again. The blue part in both of these pictures is the iris. And you see all these little flecks that move around. And these represent portions of the muscles that makes up this long sphincter-like ring of muscle. If you've noticed, when you go outside into bright light, your pupil gets smaller, your pupil constricts. And when you're in a dark room, your pupil gets bigger. The pupil itself doesn't do anything. Turns out the pupil is really just a hole that light can enter your eye through. The iris surrounds this hole and will either relax to dilate the pupil and let more light in low light situations, or it will constrict to let less light in so that you don't damage the inside of your eye with too much light during bright light circumstances. So just to recap, the iris is a pigmented, it has color, circular muscular ring. The pupil in the middle is really just a hole that the iris surrounds. The pupil itself does not change, it's just a hole. The relaxation or the constriction of the iris controls the size of that central hole, that central pupil. Behind the pupil is the lens of the eye, right here. That does the same thing as lens in a microscope or a magnifying glass. It takes the light and it refracts it slightly. And ultimately, it hopefully focuses that light on the back of the eye at a place called the macula lutea, or the fovea. This is where the image is going to be focused and then transmitted through the nerves of the eye and transmitted back to your brain. This whole back membrane that is a potential receiving area for light is the retina. Let's see, where is that on here? Is that labeled? The retina. It's a colorless, there's no pigment to it, so it has that sort of general biological pink sort of a color to it. And it's richly impregnated with blood vessels. It's a very, very, very thin membrane that it's very metabolically active and requires a lot of blood to feed those cells and to keep them nourished. The blood vessel pattern in the retina, just like anywhere else in the body, is subject to normal anatomical variation. The blood vessels may look a little bit differently if you look at the back of my eye versus the back of your own eye. All the major ones will be present, but the exact location might be slightly different between the two of us. Same thing with the iris. Everybody has all of these muscles in the iris arranged in a ring, but the iris might not be perfectly circular. The color might be different, and the specific arrangement of those little flecks that you can see in the middle may be different between you and I. In fact, they almost certainly will be different between you or I. There's so many little flecks that can be had. There's going to be some sort of obvious variation when you closely examine it. Inside of the eyeball, filling it and keeping it round, is a bunch of fluid, basically. The front of the eye in front of the lens is filled with a thin fluid, and the back is filled with a thick fluid. The front is called aqueous humor. The liquid in the back is called vitreous humor. You do not need to remember those names specifically for now, although you may remember the term vitreous humor from your death investigation lecture. But understand that when the light travels through the eye, past the cornea, past the iris, through the pupil, through the lens, it's not just going through empty space here, it's traveling through a fluid. When you're taking a picture of the back of somebody's eye, of the retina, the camera has to pick up light that goes through all of these surfaces and then reflects back to the camera. So things that eye scans can detect include eye color, of course. I mean, you and I can see that when we look at each other. Pigmentation in people is actually a very, very, very complicated thing genetically. We have lots and lots and lots of different pigment genes that all combined contribute to our overall skin, hair, eye color pigmentation. But it is heritable, and it is highly heritable. Theoretically, you could end up with an eye color that does not run in your family. That would represent a series of mutations in you that would be very, very unique. But overwhelmingly, we all have hair and eye and skin patterns that we have inherited and can be linked to other people in our family. Classifying and identifying our eye color could help us link or rule out linkage to somebody's family. Knowing that some eye colors are dominant or recessive can also help determine whether or not it's possible that somebody is related to somebody else. I have blue eyes personally in real life. Blue eyes are pretty recessive. If I have children with somebody with brown eyes and they don't have any blue-eyed family members, it's very, very likely that all of our kids will turn out with brown eyes and that my blue eyes will sort of disappear into the background and not show up for them. If I have children with somebody else who's blue-eyed, it would be very, very unlikely for me to have any children, nearly impossible to have any children who would have brown eyes. With my brown-eyed spouse, it's possible I could have blue-eyed kids, but unlikely. If I have a blue-eyed spouse, it's almost impossible that I would have brown-eyed children. It is possible, but almost almost impossible. The muscle pattern, as I mentioned around here, that creates those flecks in people's eyes can be unique to each person and can be characterized. The blood vessel pattern, that normal anatomic variation in the pattern of blood vessels in the back of somebody's eye on their retina, is quite unique to each person. Eye anatomy is thought to be unchanged during a person's lifetime. This is a foundational principle of all biometrics, including facial recognition and fingerprinting. The thought is that while your overall features might change somewhat, there's going to be at least a certain number of things that are consistent enough over the person's lifespan that you'll be able to characterize them by it for their whole life. Your fingers don't get bigger or smaller as you get older. You can characterize fingerprints your whole life. That's going to be the same from the day you're born to the day you die. The same thought applies to the back of your eye and to your iris patterns. There's not a lot of substantiation to that foundational principle, as we'll discuss more with the fingerprinting lecture. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest it. There's some correlative statistical evidence to suggest it. The odds of you coming across somebody with the same patterns as you is pretty unlikely. There's a lot of humans in the world, and so there's a lot of variation potentially. But also on that the other side of that same coin, These things are not entirely randomly distributed. There is a potential that somebody else has in close enough to the same fingerprint as you, or the same iris pattern, or the same retinal pattern as you, that our software isn't sophisticated enough to pick those up as two different people, and you could still have false matches. There is in some universities ongoing research to help further create a scientific basis for this, but at this moment, it does not really exist. Influences on readability are substantial and should be noted. So to take an iris scan, it's pretty quick and dirty. You're just going to show up in front of a camera. You're going to open your eyes. You're going to look into the camera. You can be a comfortable distance away. The camera will take, with a high resolution camera, will take a picture of your eyes using visible light wavelengths and then another one using infrared wavelengths. That'll help illuminate some of the pigments in your eyes that aren't otherwise super visible using regular wavelengths of light. It takes a hot second. You just have to not blink and then you can walk away. It does not take long at all. It's not invasive. It's easy to do. Contacts can throw this off. Lots and lots and lots and lots of people wear contact lenses. They don't have to be colored contacts to influence it either. The fact that you're wearing an additional lens in front of your eye will distort the image of your eye. It'll be slight, but looking at iris scans, the whole idea is to look for slight differences. So contact lenses can throw them off. Similarly, eyeglasses or sunglasses can also throw off these readings. It'll throw them off more so than contact lenses, in fact, because the distance between the lens and the eye is greater, which will distort the image of your eye overall. Certain conditions such as cataracts, which is a hardening and a whitening of the lens behind the pupil, can throw off this scan by changing the perceived contrast between the pupil and the eye. And if you have any kind of darkening, or that's really like a whitening, a non-translucency of the eye, the cornea in front of the iris, that can also influence iris scans pretty substantially. Retinal scans are a lot more reliable because it's harder to tweak. You know, if you want to throw off an iris scan, all you got to do is throw in some contacts. If you want to throw off a retinal scan, you need to get somebody to laser the back of your eyes, and that's going to be a lot more difficult and prohibitive than just going out and getting some contacts. So this is a much more reliable indicator, but it's pretty invasive. You have to get very, very, very close to a retinal scanner. You need to hold your eyes open for a pretty long time without blinking. You need to be lined up perfectly. The light has to be just right. It's a more intensive, invasive process. And then every time your retinas get red, you have to hold them very close, open up against a scanner for a substantial portion of time, not blinking. This is a lot harder of an image to get. Conditions that can influence a retinal scan are mostly confined to pathology and injury. So if you have an injury to the back of your eye and it's detaching a little bit, that can throw it off because your retina isn't smooth up against the back of your eye anymore. If you have any kind of glaucoma, which is going to create a thickening and darkening of that vitreous humor in the back of the eye, that can also distort the camera's perception of your retina. As I mentioned in the last slide, the photography taken with retinal scans and iris scans are taken using visible wavelength and infrared wavelengths, both. It's two separate images that it'll take. It'll go click, click, and it'll take two images back to back. A high-resolution visible wavelength photograph will be taken first, and then an infrared one to reveal any kind of nooks and crannies or nuances or changes in pigmentation that are otherwise undetectable by a regular naked eye style image. That iris data or retinal data is going to be stored and analyzed in a database. Iris data is much more popular than retinal data because it's easier to obtain, it's faster, it's less invasive. People are more okay generally with getting this done. And this is stored using iris code software. This iris code software uses extracted data from the human iris, and it quantizes the pigmentation and pattern information. So just like I was talking before, you take an image, you pick out all the important parts, and then you turn it into numerical code. That's what iris code does, but it's specific to the iris. It produces a simple binary code, numerical code, that you can compare later with a great deal more objectivity than you could if you were just looking at two photographs by yourself. Current applications of iris code technology include use by the Department of Defense, that's the DoD, and with the FBI to identify potential insurgents. In the DoD and FBI joint project, they get iris scans from people that they think are insurgents or are members of the Taliban or potential terrorists in the Middle East, around military bases that they have, outposts in Afghanistan and the like. They get iris scans of military personnel, of contractors, of staff on base, and they'll use that for a variety of reasons, up to and including if they suspect that there is a group of known insurgents in a given village. They can and have gone through entire villages and just iris scanned as many of the people as they could to find these insurgents. They've also used this information to identify decedents. The person's eye internally will degrade relatively quickly. You can get, the pigmentation can fade substantially, but even with some decomposition of the person, as long as the front of the eye hasn't lost real structural integrity, you should be able to make out some of those minutiae differences between the patterns of the musculature of the iris that can help identify somebody who's deceased. NGI, we've talked about this before with our database lectures. They collect all sorts of personal identifying information, one of which is iris codes.